Well, good afternoon, and welcome to one and all. I didn't know what to expect, how many people to expect, but I'm really delighted that you came for this workshop, and I hope we can learn from one another over the next 75 minutes or so. My name, as you know, is Father Mike Connors. I direct the Marten program here, and I'll explain in a bit why I'm doing a workshop on RCIA, because you might think it's kind of a little strange that somebody who's an academic is doing something like this, but this is actually one of the sustaining passions of my years as a priest. I've been a priest now for 35 years. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And this has been one of the things that has really helped to bring me life over the years, and so I'll say just a bit more about that. I want to just get a flavor for who you are, if I could. How many priests do we have here? Okay, and how many of you are parish priests? All, or nearly all. Okay, and then we have several deacons. How many deacons? All right, a good number of deacons. How many, and then we have Dr. Kimberly Baker, who's on the faculty at St. Meinrad and a Notre Dame grad. So nice to have you with us. How many of you are currently working with RCIA? All right, pretty much most of you. Okay, great. How many of you get frustrated with the RCIA? Sometimes. It's a big thing, huh? Would that be fair to say? Like, to do it well, there's a lot of moving parts to it, right? How many of you find it life-giving, though? Good. Good. I'm really encouraged to hear that. You know, I spent my deacon year and then my first 5 years as a priest in parish work. Those first 5 years were at Little Flower Parish here in South Bend, which is just about a mile in that direction. And of course, I don't need to tell you that as a parish minister, you do all sorts of things, right? You do all kinds of things, some which you don't particularly want to do, many of which, you know, are a privilege to do, but not necessarily something you're sort of raring to do. I must say the RCIA was the one thing on my schedule that I loved doing. I'm not exaggerating to say that I always felt that I got more out of doing it than I actually gave. And I'm not just saying that to be cute. I actually found that to be true. I just loved it. And I miss it intensely to this day. I left parish ministry in 1989. And I've only been tangentially involved in it in a few different places since then. I sometimes do Mass over at St. Mary's College, and sometimes we've had some of the rites of the RCIA over there, so it's been my privilege there to do the Easter Vigil a number of times, etc. But I miss it very much, especially come Lent. Right? Especially come Lent, when it gets intense. I still wish that I could find time for that in my schedule. Welcome. So that leads me to say just a quick word about my book. Now, this workshop is not going to be a sales pitch for my book, okay? Though I want to mention it because I think, you know, there's a lot more in here than we're going to have time to discuss today, and I'm not going to go through all parts of this. But I just want to say that, you know, writing this book for me was like the payment of a debt. It was like something I wanted to do and felt for all these years like it was just something my heart really wanted to do. And so that's why I wrote this book at the invitation of LTP, to shed some light or at least gather some of my own experience with preaching in particular through the RCIA. Is it a good book? I don't know. All I know is that it really came out of something that's been very, very important for me. Here's what I'd like to do with our time in kind of a general way. I don't want to talk terribly long. I want us to share some of our wisdom from one another. So what I thought I might do is talk about two parts of what I did in the book. There are actually three parts to the book. The first part is kind of a flyover view of the parish that the RCIA presumes. Now, this is of interest to me because actually not a lot has been written about this. When you read this book, here's my old dog-eared copy of the RCIA, right? We should all have a copy of this. I'm sure you are familiar with it. When you read that book, it actually presumes a certain kind of community to make it work. Okay? And not a lot has been sort of written and teased out about that. So in the first 2 chapters of the book, I tried to say some things about that. Not the last word by any means, but I tried to put together, or at least begin to paint a picture of what's being presumed behind this rite in order to do what it says and do it well. Again, no small thing to do that, right? So that's what you find in the first 2 chapters. Then you find in the next section, chapters 3 through 9, I go through each of the rites, each of the major rites, and each of the major seasons, and try to just say something about some of the preaching opportunities that are in those. A little bit on the scripture readings that go with some of those rites, the rituals themselves, the challenges of each of the period, pre-catechumenate, catechumenate, the period of purification, enlightenment, and then finally mystagogy. Okay, so that's what I do in those chapters. I'm not going to actually talk about that today, though when we open it up later, I'd be happy to sort of go into that if there's some things you want to focus on. But the last part of the book, chapter 10, is the chapter where I tried to talk in a more general way about what it means to preach for discipleship. Okay? Again, not much has been written about that. You know, what does it mean to preach for discipleship in a way that generates that kind of commitment? Because I think, you know, we can define discipleship, I suppose, in different ways, but probably a common element is that these are people who are really serious about the journey, right? They're committed to the journey. How many of you have read Sherry Weddell's book, Forming Intentional Disciples? Forming Intentional Disciples. Okay, a good number of you. I wonder how you found it. I found it an interesting and provocative read. I have a few problems with it. There are a few places where I thought maybe her theology was maybe a little narrow still, but still a very interesting read, and it does seem like it sort of provoked some good conversation in the church. I know some people around here, like campus ministry staff, has read it and they're talking about it. So, interesting read, and I know what she's talking about, right? We're looking to form intentional disciples, or to use somebody else's language, missionary disciples. People who are serious enough about their following of Jesus that they move into action, get into mission. Make sense? You can use the language you want, but again, I found her book at least helpful in raising up for reflection something that I think we all know to be true. Namely, there are some people in our parishes who are really serious about following Jesus, right? And there are others that are kind of along for the ride, or we don't know what their discipleship constitutes, right? They may be very serious about it, but we haven't had a chance to maybe really know what their faith is like. They may be acting it out in tremendously self-sacrificial ways in their marriage, in their families, and what they do in the marketplace, and so on. So it's not to make a judgment about that. So again, there isn't much written on preaching for discipleship, and I make a few suggestions in the book about what that might mean, and I'm going to add one more today in this presentation, and we'll see what you think. And I would love to hear some of your wisdom about this. Drawing from your own preaching or observation of preaching, you know, the question is, what works, right? I've been the Marten director now for 10 years, and I think for the first few years, I regarded my role as kind of like a doctor, you know, like what's wrong with Catholic preaching? My attention has been sort of reversed. Now I'm more asking the question, what works, right? We do have some things that work. Most people think Catholic preaching is not that great. And I suppose in some way I share that diagnosis. But actually, we do have some interesting and good preachers, and we should ask ourselves, what does effectiveness, what does success as a preacher actually look like? And I think we can actually learn some things from that more positive question, rather than wringing our hands about how awful Catholic preaching is. What can we actually raise up for positive reflection? Okay? Let's see, there's a... can you all hear me in the back? Okay. All right, great. I'm just going to move over here so you can see the screen a little bit better. Whoops. So the thesis of the book and the thesis behind this workshop is one that I didn't actually state until the 10th chapter. And that is that I really do believe that the RCIA can be a phenomenal engine of intentional disciple making. I really firmly believe that. Is this a great picture or what? I want to preach so that people react to their baptism like that. Right? That'd be great. And a few times I think I've seen that happen. I'll never forget the year when I was in Little Flower and we built a baptismal pool. By the way, the secret to my success, if there was a success at Little Flower, was the team I had to work with. I had a phenomenal team of lay leaders to work with. So one of them went to the farm store and got this big tank that's usually used for watering horses and built a beautiful wooden sort of ring around it, and we did baptisms by immersion. Fantastic. Once you've done baptism by immersion, it'll be very hard to go back, right? To sprinkling water, it's very hard to go back. It's that powerful. I'll never forget getting into that tank myself and looking up at this line of people who were coming to be baptized, and I said to them, "Come to the water." One by one, they came in, and I'll never forget Darlene Nolan in particular, whose face was just beaming at this moment of grace for her. Now, preaching is not going to produce that every time, but preaching is an important part of what makes this work. And I think perhaps you've at least glimpsed that in your own ministry. I certainly hope so. So that's my thesis. I think this done well, and that's a big if, that's a very big if, this can be a fantastic way of leading people toward serious discipleship. And I'm not simply thinking of the catechumens, okay? I'm also thinking of all those people in the parish who collaborate to make this work. Some of the most striking transformation that I saw in those years in parish work was actually in the sponsors and the catechists who worked on the whole process. Some of you have seen that? Inevitably, it makes people wonder, what's going on here? Why is this so special? Why do these people, these catechumens, seem to think this is so special? Maybe I've got something to learn here. So there's my thesis. As maybe a bit of background, this is a bit of the orientation that I've been bringing to our work on homiletics here, including the Preaching Academy and other things. Why do we preach? In a nutshell, it's for encounter, to lead people into the experience of God, to make the experience of God more likely, more accessible for people. And of course, it's not just the preaching that carries that, right? Every one of our liturgies is really composed of two things: the Word of God, which is the proclamation of the Scriptures, and the preaching, and then the table of the Eucharist. And these go together in a way that's something like saying and doing, or saying and showing. If you hear a resonance of David Tracy's theology here, it's probably conscious. These should go together to bring people closer to God. I think the most gratifying thing that a preacher can hear is someone who says to you in the back of church, not simply nice homily, Father, though we all like to hear that, right, or deacon, but somebody who says, you know, you really helped me come closer to God. And even further, you know, Father, I listened to your homily last week, and I went home and made up with my wife. Or I came to a decision to pitch in with the parish soup kitchen. Or act differently in the school or the factory where I work. When you have this encounter with God, there's nothing sweeter. Right? There's nothing that can take its place. And it does change us. Leads to what, you know, the Bible, St. Paul at least, often calls metanoia, conversion, transformation. And on the basis of that, then people can make commitment and move into a serious discipleship as a way of life. Now, sometimes I think, you know, one of the things we perhaps forget in our preaching is that there is a necessary order here, right? That you can't just sort of scold people into being serious disciples. Pope Francis has been saying this himself, and I say it to my students all the time. Moralistic preaching just doesn't work. You know, moralistic preaching is sort of like scolding people or getting them to act in a certain way, but without the gas in the tank to do it. It's sort of like telling Stan to drive to Fort Wayne, but without the gas in the tank. It doesn't work. The energy for changing your life morally has to come from this encounter with Jesus, with Christ. Okay, that's the only place it can come from in a meaningful kind of way. So I would exhort you to remember that. This is one of the reasons why I say to my students, every homily should be good news. If you preach good enough news, then you can challenge. Indeed, if you preach big enough and strong enough good news, you can challenge quite strongly. People will rise to it because people are hungry for that challenge. But what they're really hungering for is something they can only find in the spiritual life as a disciple of Jesus. Okay, so just a little kind of background on my orientation, at least in terms of what's important with preaching. Here's the summary. We preach for encounter. We preach to bring people closer to God, to guide, to facilitate or make more possible the encounter of our hearers with a living God. The living is important here, right? Not just God as a literary figure or a historical figure, but a living God. Our tradition is very insistent that we are worshiping and seeking a God who still speaks to us today as surely as that God spoke to people in times past, in biblical times. Meeting the living God changes us. We call this metanoia. On the basis of that transformation, which is an ongoing, lifelong process, we become disciples who live differently, devoted to service and mission. So this is like the theme we've been working on here at Notre Dame for some time now. Preach for encounter. Preach for encounter. And how do we do that? That's maybe another workshop. I think I tried to address that in my address 2 years ago at the conference. Well, now, what is discipleship? We could linger over that for a moment. Of course, one of the figures that comes to mind for me is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Right? How many of you have read The Cost of Discipleship? So Bonhoeffer, for those of you who don't know him, was a Lutheran pastor who objected to the Nazis and ended up being imprisoned, and near the end of the war was killed. So he is a martyr for the faith. And he wrote this book. That was actually before he went to prison. He wrote this book, The Cost of Discipleship. And the title is kind of revealing. Just a couple of lines to give you a bit of the flavor. When we are called to follow Christ, we are summoned to an exclusive attachment to his person Christianity without the living Christ is inevitably Christianity without discipleship. And Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ. It remains an abstract idea, a myth. There's one other very famous line from Bonhoeffer. I bet somebody here knows it. Pardon me. Anybody know the line? Well, yeah, that's not what I was thinking of. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. That's a famous one too, but I actually have another one in mind. Bonhoeffer says, when Christ calls a man, forgive the exclusive language, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. When Christ calls a person, he bids them come and die. So this is somebody who's quite serious about discipleship and its cost. And he paid the full cost, actually, in his own life. So, want some interesting reading on discipleship, some challenging Lenten reading, pick up Bonhoeffer sometime. I already mentioned Sherry Waddell's book. She's got a couple of others too, including this one called Becoming a Parish of Intentional Disciples. How many of you have read this book by John Kavanaugh? Dan Luby has read it. Anyone else? So a quick word about this book. John F. Kavanaugh, S.J., Jesuit priest, just died in the last couple of years. Was in St. Louis. I never heard him preach myself, but I hear he was quite an amazing preacher. Following Christ in a Consumer Society. Another very provocative read. Following Christ in a Consumer Society. Do you think we're in a consumer society? I think that's one word for it, perhaps, right? So he's wrestling with what this means to be a disciple in our time and place. What are the obstacles, and what are maybe some of the strategies that we could employ? It's not a book on preaching per se, but I think it could be a very good read for many of us who do preach or teach. Maybe some of you have known these resources, the Rebuilt folks, Father Michael White and Tom Corcoran. How many of you read that? Either of those? A few. Father James Mallon, Divine Renovation, familiar to anyone? Interesting reads. They also have some things to say to us, I think, about preaching a message that actually matters to people's lives. Worthwhile. Great Catholic Parishes by William Simon. A few of you maybe have read that. And this middle one by one of my great heroes, Father Art Baranowski, who's one of our presenters at this conference. His vision is to revise or to reform the parish into small communities of people. I was moved years ago by his vision. This book goes back now to about 1985, something like that. It's still a vision that I find very moving. And of course, the RCIA itself. Other resources that you may know of? Any other books or articles come to mind that have helped you to clarify how to preach well for discipleship? Okay. Let's talk for just a few minutes about what sort of parish is presumed by the RCIA. Dan, can you read this all the way in the back there? It's a little bit small maybe for this room. What I did in my book was take paragraph 75, which is one of the keys to the whole thing, actually, and it rests on this fourfold understanding of what it means to be church. I have tried without success to actually find what the origin is of that fourfold ecclesiology, and it seems to be so old that no one exactly knows where it is. I mean, ultimately it's biblical, right? But no one seems to know who put these together. Kerygma, the place of the word, right? The announcement of the word, place with a lively interest in the scriptures and in evangelization. Koinonia, a place of fellowship, community, shared life, shared faith, a community of communities, if you follow Baranowski or some others who have spoken about the parish that way. Liturgia, worship, prayer, a place where liturgy is taken seriously and done well, including preaching. And diaconia, service, mission, concern for social justice. How many of you think that you are in an evangelizing parish? No one? Maybe. I don't think we have many parishes in the Catholic Church that are really evangelizing. My opinion, don't shoot me, but I don't think we have many parishes that are really very serious about evangelizing. Some of our Protestant brothers and sisters do much better with this, right? I remember sitting in a Retreats International class here in the summer one time years ago, and the late Father Jean Laverdiere was the teacher, and we had a fundamentalist guy who was in the back of the room, and he was actually a very interesting conversation partner. But at one point he raised his hand and said, "You know, we're eating your lunch," he said. Right? I mean, how many of us know people who have gone to drifted away from Catholicism, or at least drifted partly away, and they're now attending a Protestant, evangelical, or Pentecostal church?
Yeah, but they come back.
Well, sometimes they do. Sometimes they keep a foot in both worlds.
Some people, we were giving Bible classes, both in Spanish and English. And then the pastor would take time out on a Wednesday and Tuesday in the evening, and 2 hours of Bible class every week. He even put it on the internet, you know. And then some people would leave, and I caught up with a few of those people. Well, why did you leave? Oh, they weren't teaching the Bible. But these people are teaching the Bible. What are you talking about? He was giving a class every week.
Interesting, yeah.
So I don't think it was just teaching. I think it was the fellowship or something.
Yeah, there are lots of reasons, right?
Yeah.
There are lots of reasons why people drift away. I think one of them is, though, that they find something in some of these other places that they're hungry for. Well, anyway, evangelization is a much bigger topic, and we actually have some beautiful documents on evangelization, but not all of it's sort of happening at the local level. Another element, I think, of what it means to be an evangelizing parish has to do with collaborative leadership. The pastor should not be the sole evangelizer, right? This is not the vision of Vatican II, is that everyone who's baptized becomes part of the evangelizing mission. How can we help to make that happen? As I said, my experience in the RCIA ministry was that I had a great team of collaborators. And they all took their faith, with great seriousness. So we could go on about what it means to be the sort of parish that is envisioned by the RCIA, but sometimes I do feel like, and not to be too negative, like we're trying to enact this thing that actually presumes a whole substructure, a whole foundation, a whole quality of life together that isn't always there. So parish renewal is I think, something we need to take quite seriously. All right, let's move then to some of my suggestions for preaching for discipleship. And you can tell me what you think about some of these ideas. I think one is simply tap into the power of the rites. Okay, the rites as we have them done well are very powerful. Don't give in to the pressure to minimalize. This is like one of the American sort of tendencies. We sort of do the minimum, right? We're self-conscious about having these rites when the larger culture is sort of anti-ritual. I don't know, there may be lots of lots of reasons, but do the rites and do them well and don't omit them. Like don't just do one scrutiny, do all three. And do them with as much energy and verve as you can bring to that, with as much competent music, etc., and preaching as well. Do them without apology. And as an opportunity for all. Remember that as you do these rites, they're not just for the catechumens. They're for all of us. Right? They have something to say, to preach to all of us. So direct your attention and your way of leading prayer and your preaching to the whole assembly. The rites, if you take the rites seriously, you really find that the rites themselves preach everything that is needed for a full and rich life in Christ. I mean that quite seriously. If you take the rites and you honor every part of them, they spread out an incredible vision of what it means to live life in Christ. The preacher's task then is to unpack the power, to point it out, to bring it to the hearer's attention, and to connect it to life experience. Okay, that's no small task, but if you do the rites well, I think you find your preaching task is actually so much the easier. Remember, these are not merely illustrations, but they actually convey what they signify. These are sacramental moments, in other words. They actually convey what they signify. That is God's living presence. Thus, the rites are text for preaching as surely as are the scriptures. In fact, the rites are themselves bound up with scripture, right? The very language is drawn from the Bible. Remember that liturgy has a holistic power. That is, it appeals not only to our heads, but it gets our bodies engaged. It appeals to our imaginations. More and more, as an aside, I'll just say this, more and more my attention in preaching is drawn to how it can evoke an imagination of an alternative way of life. You know, in our culture, we still tend to be somewhat dismissive of the imagination, right? Oh, Jim, that's just your imagination, you know. Actually, the imagination is in many ways very key to leading us into any kind of life change or social change. Appeal to the imagination, our hearts, our will. One of the standard bits of advice I give to my students is heed the advice of St. Augustine. Preach is to teach. We have an Augustine scholar sitting right here. Preaching is to teach, to delight, and to persuade or move to action. That rests on a threefold understanding of the human person as mind, heart, and will. Every homily should appeal to all three. Every homily should appeal to all three. If you want the effect to be holistic, as the Bible always does, right? The Bible has this holistic sort of power. Appeal to all three. Mystagogical preaching. This would be like the subject for another workshop, but I think mystagogical preaching should be one of our staples. And by mystagogical preaching, I mean exactly what I said up above, like unpacking the power of the rites, helping people to see it, to access it. The early church thrived on mystagogical preaching. I think not that we need to do exactly what Augustine did, but we can learn a lot from studying what the early church did and doing it in our own time. So that's number one, tap into the power of the rites. Number two, again, preach for encounter. Preach to evoke or make possible real mystical experience. We've got to end our marginalization of the mystical, like as if it's so specialized that it's not available to everyone. I don't believe that. I think the doctrine of the third person of the Trinity tells us God wants this for all of God's people. Preach for real mystical experience. I've sometimes said to my students, when you end preaching, people should feel like there's a hand being reached out to them. All they need to do is take it. Okay? People are hungry for truth, for relationship, for meaning, for love. And all of those together, right? So every homily should have a way of connecting with what people are most hungry for in their deepest inner life. Appeal to the imagination, use story, metaphor, image, paradox. Sometimes I think we're a bit too embarrassed about paradox, when paradox is actually like the doorway into mystery. This has been something that our tradition, I think, has always insisted on, the paradoxical. It respects the limits of language. Draw on the languages of spirituality. Another topic, what are the languages of spirituality? You might begin by asking what languages of spirituality, what spiritual texts have worked for you, brought you closer to the Lord. And then, not that you have to do exactly what those people did, but it has a way of maybe fertilizing your own imagination to find a language that will work for people today. The language of spirituality, although it's diverse, right? There's the Ignatian way, there's the Benedictine way, we've got this incredible treasury, but there are some common elements, I think. The language of spirituality is always relational, for one thing. Right? It's more like the language of lovers or close friends than it is like a lecture. Okay? Find bits of that sort of language that work for you and work for people today. Remember that the Paschal mystery is not just something that happened to Jesus, but it's something that's written into our own lives and stories. The Paschal mystery is something we should never tire of talking about, because it's always God's invitation to some life beyond death. Right? That's the story. Convey authenticity and urgency. You know this, right? If you don't appear like you're invested in what you're saying, people are not going to really stay with you. This is not an invitation to make preaching all about yourself. Not at all. But it is to say that the messenger is important. And if you don't convey that this is actually meaningful for your life, they'll pick up on that within about 2 minutes, I think. And they'll start thinking about what they're going to do after Mass or something else. Respect the limits of words. I said to our Preaching Academy folks yesterday, one of the reasons to keep preaching relatively brief is that it respects that words can only take us so far. And then we need to fall silent again and enter into mystery in that way as well. Okay, it's not that one is better than the other, words or silence, it's that the two go together and need to go together. Okay, number 3, preach toward conversion and transformation. I don't know if any of you might have read Rosemary Houghton's book years ago called The Transformation of Man. Any of you read that book? It was kind of a classic from the 60s. Her way of talking was that the whole reason we do formation, and Catholicism knows a lot about formation, is for transformation, right? To dispose people toward something that only God can do. Faith keeps on growing. It's a restless thing, a thing that asks questions. I think too often we give people a kind of faith that's sort of static, and it's sort of like you've either got it or not. Well, actually, faith isn't that simple. Real faith causes one to continue to question. As someone said, it not only comforts the afflicted, but it afflicts the comfortable. Right? You've heard that? I saw that years ago on a banner. Comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. Real faith does that. It's as likely to keep you awake at night as it is to make you just pull up a warm blanket. Remember to preach again for the whole person. Preaching is non-coercive, but it does appeal to people for a genuine interior yes. Okay, it's non-coercive, it can't be manipulative, but it does appeal for a genuine interior yes. The method, the message, the style all serve conversion. White and Corcoran talk about preaching for life change. Now, I'm pretty sure they borrowed that phrase from some evangelical sources, but it has meaning for us too, right? We're preaching for life change, and not just to change somebody's mind, but preaching in such a way that they get the whole picture that can actually change what their life is even about. Simon says that good parishes, effective parishes, set spiritual maturity as a goal. They reimagine the programs and activities of a parish as ways to help people grow closer to Jesus Christ. So what he's saying is that good parishes reimagine everything they do oriented toward this goal. Yes, even the finance committee, right? Even the finance committee can be an occasion for raising up for people, what is it that we're trying to do here? The whole reason we're engaged in finances is because we need those to move our mission forward. Interesting to think about what that might mean for us. Number 4, preach a vision of transformation that is both personal and social. Remember that the Bible knows no rigid distinction between these. Conversion's always both personal or interior and personal social. Okay? So the social justice homily, I'm trying to get away from that language because I think it sort of suggests that that's a special department. There are social implications to the gospel all over the place. Okay? If it's about the reign of God, that vision, the kingdom of God, challenges us to build a different kind of society, starting with our own families, our own parish community. True north is always the reign of God for us. Remember that this was always the main point of Jesus' own preaching. It's about the kingdom of God. What did he mean by that? And how does it challenge us? It's an entire social ecology, if you will, the basis for working for both individual and social or structural change. And it is already and not yet. You know this from your studies, right? The reign of God is both already here among us, breaking in, and at the same time, not yet. Live in that tension. Number 5, challenge, sacrifice, costly discipleship. Comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. I have heard this point disputed. I seem to face this regularly with my students, at least one or two of them, who come at this from the point of view that people don't really want to be challenged. They just want to kind of sit there like couch potatoes. I think that's a very pessimistic view of people. I think people do want to be challenged by something real. Not just challenge for the sake of challenge, but they are hungering for something. And they're willing to, if they think you've got the real goods, so to speak, they're willing to accept that challenge in their life. They're hungry for that. If you've read Carla Bellinger's book, my colleague, one of the things she found in her study of how young people react to preaching is that they said to her, "Go deeper. We're tired of superficial preaching. Go deeper." And deeper means into the life of the Spirit. Okay, not just deeper into morality or doctrine disconnected from life, but go deeper into what this means for our lives. Avoid moralism, we've talked about that. Self-emptying love. In a few words, this is what we see in Christ, right? Self-emptying love. I loved that story that Carrie told last night about the 13-year-old who said, she wanted to die saving someone else's life. there's a fantastic sort of image of self-emptying love. This is what we want to offer people and raise up. Well, and it's right there, right? We've all got the crucifix in our churches. There's the image of it. Oops. Again, preach so that people might respond in faith. Take that hand. Decide to pay attention and be more like him. All right, now here's the last point, and the one that I've sort of added to what I did in the book, because it's maybe the one that I'm. All of these overlap, right? But this is the one I've been sort of finding myself talking or thinking about more as one of the challenges we face in today's world. Background. I hear a lot of spiritual talk that's disconnected from Christ or disconnected from anything that we would call salvation history, right? Our faith depends on the belief that God reveals God's self in history. If you don't have one foot in history, then you're prone to a kind of Gnosticism, right? You don't then have a reason to take with full seriousness what daily life means, or what Keith's life story means, or what somebody else's life story might mean. I'm a little worried about this because I sometimes hear this sort of disconnect even from Christians, right? They sort of like draw abstract principles from maybe the life of Christ, but don't really affirm that it's actually rooted in a particular history. This is a hard sell in an age that's sort of dominated by technology, by abstract principles, and also by the need to get along with people of other religious traditions, which is real, right? One way of sort of approaching that is to sort of distance yourself a little bit from all that particular stuff about Christ. And I think something is lost here. I realize I'm a little scattered on this because this is where I'm still pondering what this means. I do think this is one of the challenges for us in preaching the gospel in our time and place. It's what I think it was Metz who called the scandal of particularity. It's scandalous in a way that Christianity insists that all of history hinges on this one person and his life story. It's actually scandalous that Jewish faith would say, the whole history depends on the Exodus, God's intervention in history. Maybe we need to accept that challenge. I just think that a lot of sort of like pop or new age spirituality is just so generalized, abstract, kind of reductionist, that it ends up then either denigrating the body or exalting the body maybe beyond its real meaning, disconnects then from our social and political responsibilities, and you end up with a kind of Gnostic. Does this make sense? I see a few heads nodding. I'm grasping for an articulation here that I'm not quite satisfied with. We claim that the nexus of human history is in salvation history, which is capped off or finds its apex in the life of Jesus Christ. Okay, that's a pretty bold claim in our era. At least it seems to me that it runs into some presumptions in our society that are pretty strong against it. What we're looking for here, I think, is what I would call Christocentrism, not Christomonism. What do I mean by that? Christ is the center of our faith. Christomonism, though, is more like a heresy that says Christ is the only thing that matters. There's no need for the Old Testament, for example. No need for anything else. Well, that's not what we're looking for, but a Christ-centered faith. Okay? Only the incarnation and the redemption take history and human life seriously. I really believe this more and more, and this is part of what actually makes the RCIA work. It's a very Christocentric process, right? The rites, if you follow the rites, you're following the life of Jesus Christ. Much as the Ignatian exercises do. How many of you have done the Ignatian exercises? A few. Okay, so you know, some of you know, like the power of the Ignatian exercises is that you walk through the life of Christ intensely, right? That's what makes it work. There's something like that at work here in the RCIA, and if we disconnect from that, we've lost something, I think. Okay, time for me to stop. Your thoughts, Father Nolan.
Well, when you talk about the story of salvation history, it makes a lot of sense when you think about how we want to do things in the shortest timeline possible, especially in the RCIA. Because we're still moving on consumer mentality. We're dealing with a commodity, which is your sacraments, your faith, that sort of thing. And then even in the best of times when they see it as a journey, it's a journey that we're going to control. And it's not going to be controlled for us or by us, whether we're the team or the candidates or something like that. I think a lot of what you're saying really makes a lot of sense about why we're in a hurry to do everything we are to do, rather than leaving Jesus Christ to be the one who does this and carries us forth, and we discern as we move along what to do when, what's the proper place in that. I mean, like when conversion comes, it's an act of God, there is response, but God chooses the way and the time, and it's not really convenient, it's usually not very efficient, it's not usually very American. That's my meaning of it.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought much about that, but I think you're right. We in our society are so concerned about time, like using it well. I think that does sort of press.
Besides our time and our life, there's nothing beyond this.
Yeah,
We live like that. Even though we don't believe like that, we live like that.
yes. I think I know what you're talking about.
So I don't want to waste any time.
Right. Don't want to waste any time. We look for the shortest way there. And so sometimes we cut corners by sort of like distilling principles or abstractions rather than.
I'm really good at it. If you need lessons, I do that.
Okay. Okay. I think you're onto something, though. I really do. One of the problems, that happens with the RCIA is that we truncate the whole process. The book itself says it should take at least a year. Now, it's talking about real catechumens, starting from ground zero. It should take at least a year. What do? We press it into 7 months, basically, often. And I've been part of that, so I'm indicting myself, too.
Because we don't want to lose anyone?
Yeah, and we're so fixed on the academic schedule, right? The year begins at Labor Day, and it ends with Easter. Easter is the graduation ceremony, right? There's something about the mindset we bring to this and force it into. Dan?
Can you talk a little bit about, I doubt that anybody would dispute that authenticity in the preacher is critical. I'm trying to think about, short of saying that 1,000 times in a semester to my students, how do I help them kind of get inside what that means and looks like? Because it's so deep in human formation. It feels like the classroom or the preaching lab is kind of at the top of a very deep a root that I'm just trying to figure out, how do I help them know what it means to be authentic? What do you think people, how do you think people recognize authenticity in a preacher?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Let's see if anybody here has a thought. How do you recognize authenticity?
I think maybe a contrary example might help. If you looked at what inauthentic preaching would be, someone who is not living what they're saying, that might give you an insight into the opposite.
Okay, so it could be a contrast.
I think we think of something we share really as one, as human beings. And I think of one is vulnerability. I think the preacher has to be vulnerable, first of all,
Yes.
to their community. So And people are attracted to that because that's something in common, like everyone is vulnerable to something. But sometimes we have the temptation of knowing it all and all the stuff, so we preach from what we know and everything and from a high chair, and that doesn't work, and they sense that and shut up.
I think you're onto something, a point that I used to actually resist. But there is a place for vulnerability, I think, in preaching. Again, it can be overdone so that it becomes all about you. But there is a place for someone who witnesses, you know, God did this in my life and has helped me to overcome whatever. You know, there has to be a place for that.
That's it, that's the connecting thing.
Mary Ann.
The phrase "you can't pour from an empty cup" comes to mind. I think an authentic preacher is somebody who takes care of himself or herself, and it doesn't let himself or herself be pulled off in so many different directions that you find yourself on Saturday afternoon going, "Oh my God, I got to write a homily," but that it's a planned priority in your life. It is, you're preaching from lived experience, and that you take the time to renew yourself so that you have something to give.
Yeah.
I see an awful lot of unhealthy preachers out there who stand there and talk about how, we need to take care of ourselves. Like, you first, Father. Sorry, but, I think that's part of authenticity. It's
very true.
I mean, it's one thing to say, yes, this is something I'm struggling with and I don't do really well with it. But to say, this is a priority that I'm working on, join me on that.
Steve, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that sometimes you just got to lead by example. I tell my students that if I was to get up and preach on Sunday morning and say, the sanctity of marriage is about whatever, and then you saw me leaving the no-tell motel with somebody other than my wife on Saturday morning, well, my words don't mean anything. And people watch how you work throughout the course of the week, whether it's in pastoral ministry, whether it's in the workplace, teaching, whatever it might be. And our lived example as preachers, as ministers, is really how we live our lives. So that question about authenticity really is, how do we live our life? People want to see somebody preaching who lives the gospel. And is not just talking about it. It's the old adage, right? You're not only talking the talk, but you're walking the walk. And they know when it's real or not.
They do, yeah. I would just maybe add to that, though, that none of us are perfect, and people know when we're really on the journey, right? Perfection is not required, otherwise none of us would speak. But people know when you're really on the journey. Yes.
As we're talking about this, I'm sitting here reflecting on pastors I've had and known, and thinking, who would I consider to be the most authentic? And the ones that come to mind all have these same characteristics that we're talking about. They live it. They may not be doing everything you want them to do, but they're living it. And they're never afraid to talk about their own failings. And I've just seen that as a common thing. And it's not something that we can say, hey, everybody, become authentic. Here's the methodology. Your listeners know when you're real, and they know when you're not. They can tell if you're authentic in what you are doing. I don't care if it's a homily or a talk or anything that if you're making a presentation to a group. They will know, and they will know in their hearts if this is an authentic voice that they're hearing. Before I retired and all that, I spent like 40 years in broadcasting. And I always found that places that I worked, the guys who were real were the ones that drew the biggest audiences. You may not like them, but there was an authenticity there that they had that the average listener was going to relate to. And I think we're looking at the same thing. if I'm authentic in when I say I believe it, if I'm living it, it's going to come through. But not everybody's going to love it. But they don't have to, and that's not the point. But I think they will sense this, they'll know it, and you will soon know who are the ones that are authentic simply because of the way congregations react to them.
Remember when Pope Francis was elected, the first thing he did? He asked for our prayers.
Yes.
I wept, honestly. I thought, oh wow, this is somebody who's real. And then that interview, and they asked him, who is Bergoglio? I'm a sinner. I found that very powerful. Who had a hand up back there? Yes, please.
I was just, as I was listening, agreeing the authenticity comes from living in your life. But sometimes there are barriers and tactical barriers we put in front of ourselves that even don't let the fact that we are living an authentic life shine through when we bang out the text and simply read it, and we aren't looking at them or relating it or having a conversational sort of an element to what we're doing. Or we may read somebody else's text and think that is incredible to share, but then it's clear that you're reading something of somebody else's, and those sorts of things can tune people out and make you think that you're not authentic even when you are. So there's the living it, and then there's the ensuring that your delivery allows that authenticity to pass through, because you can create barriers for yourself standing at the pulpit or wherever you are that don't let that shine through.
Did you bring your hand up earlier?
I did. Yeah, I was just going to say, from a Christian point of view, when I think of a pastor who meant a great deal to me and to our parish, I didn't really realize this about him until right as he was moving to another parish. But I told him, I said, Father, you know what I realize about you? You know us, and you love us anyway. And that's what, when I think about talking about living the life, walking the talk and all that to me was the vulnerability. He certainly shared sometimes some of his own stories in the pulpit, but it was, to me, the fact that, he knew us in a way that I couldn't believe when you would hear what he would say about different people. And then I thought, and as aggravating as I know we were, that he was the one that led a parish merger, 3 parishes becoming 1. And so I know that was a humongous headache. But you could tell that he loved us. And so then when he would preach or do various things or bring the news of what's the parish merger going to look like, you knew he was doing it from a place of love because he had taken the time to get to know us. And I think that I listened to him as a preacher in a different way once I understood that about him.
I sometimes tell my students about Father Paul Beater. Some of you know him from our local diocese. I can name him now because he's dead. But from like a technical point of view, he did almost nothing right as a preacher. But he was so kind. He was like, you just knew within 2 minutes you're in the presence of the real deal here, right? I mean, it's just something about the guy that he was just so kind to everyone that you wanted to listen to him. Kindness and humility. I think that the one unforgivable sin for people in their clergy is a lack of humility. Even the simplest believer in the far back row knows that this is something about humility. Sorry. Yes, please.
I think a comment, you had the rights book that was there, and you talked about the fact that it presupposes that a community understands what's happening. Now, just from my own particular experience, I've been ordained 25 years, I've been at RCIA for 37 years. So I've been doing this for a while. Mm-hmm. And I make my students, as they're teaching homiletics, and I always have my students come up with a homily where it's geared towards a community that has a catechumen. Because it's really important in our preaching to be able to take the congregation and draw them into this. So that book, I believe, when the RCA really came into its own, somewhere around, 81, 82, something like that, whatever it might be, the community was filled with people who were much more involved in church than they are today. It's just, the whole mentality is different. So we're constantly catechizing and evangelizing our congregation as we preach. But I think that might be time for that book to look a little differently. I don't know.
Retranslated, so.
It's going to be retranslated.
It's a retranslation process, so that may be,
There we go.
much like we came to a new and deeper understanding of the Mass through the new translation of the Roman Missal. I'm hoping that the retranslation of the RCIA will result in that. It has its potential, the potential for that.
So,
We need to be planning for resources too.
sorry?
We need to be planning resources for that. Let's get into that so we can be moving forward.
When is that going to happen, Mary Ann, do you know?
I think they're at the very early stages of it.
I don't know what to hope for from that, really.
I'm a little
That's
worried,
fine.
but that's,
It's made me nervous too. Dan, a lot of this was in response to your question about authenticity, and I think we all recognize it as a really important question.
Yeah, I would agree, and I thank everybody for, it was a very rich dialogue. And I agree with the things that people said about walk the walk and all of that. The thing that I struggle with is helping. I mean, I think there are a lot of parishes, a lot of preachers who, if they're very much not walking or talking the walk or walking the talk, if they're very much hypocritical and they're ugly to people and they're dismissive of altar servers in the middle of Mass and stuff like that, people spot that inconsistency right away. The thing I struggle with still a bit is when people only see the preacher for 7, 8, 12 minutes a week or once a month, how can the sincerity and the authenticity of the preacher be communicated when they never see you any other time? And I'm thinking particularly of a lot of deacons I know who get to preach only rarely, and who, because they're in a giant parish with 10 deacons, a lot of people don't even know who they are. So the preacher who's a circuit rider, and I think it has something to do with being known by the people, like Kimberly was saying about recognizing that the pastor or the preacher loves them. So just thinking about seminary students and helping them to kind of strategize for how they can be known by people without it being the Father Dan show. It still is a challenge, but I've gotten a lot of rich food for thought from this conversation.
You have a parish that has 10 deacons?
You know, I'm poetically. I don't think. I mean, in Dallas, where I'm from, there are, and maybe some of you who are here from Dallas could correct me, but I think there are some that have many multiples of deacons. 4, 5, 6 deacons, 5.
We have 7.
So
I know parishes in Chicago, several that have 7 or 8.
yeah. So if the deacon is allowed to preach once a month, which I think is a common practice, at least in my part of the world, and people don't get to see you or hear you very often to make a judgment, unless it's something that comes through the actual act of preaching. And that's what I'm wanting to kind of hone in.
Yeah, I see your point. I always wanted people in the parish to see me doing other things. You know, pitching in with the dishes. Or, you know, we organize Sunday afternoon softball. That brings out the good Catholic competitiveness, right? But there's something like important about that in terms of the relationship that makes preaching work.
Something about being a real person.
Yeah. Other thoughts, questions? We're coming down to the end. Andrew?
Well, kind of springboarding from that, you know, how to get everything for everybody when we don't have all the time. This is more of a practical question I'm asking for your experience and others. During Lent, when we have the scrutinies, every time you have scrutiny, you're A readings. which if you're in a parish which doesn't have 10 deacons, and can't divide up the readings, means you might be preparing 2 or 3 homilies for, one for the elect and another for another community. If you're preaching multiple languages, multiplies everything. Some parishes take the response and they say, all right, everybody gets your A readings. And we just do everything the same for everybody. I'm just wondering how other people have been able to navigate that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't know if you've heard this, Miriam, but I've heard that possibly when the RCIA is revised, they'll do away with the B and C readings for those scrutiny Sundays. Just everybody's going to do A.
If you have a catechumen in your parish. If you don't have any catechumens, we had a year with just candidates, so we were able to do the B-cycle readings that year. But if you have a catechumen, you have to do the A-cycle.
And personally, I have no problem with moving the whole Mass schedule to the A readings. Then the parish is walking with the catechumens no matter which liturgy you attend. And I think that's allowed. But I take your point for sure, right? I mean, it gets complicated when you're trying to, and you mentioned even 2 languages, right? I mean, that it gets even more complicated. They are.
There's so much there.
And our tradition really does support that. These texts are particularly important. Not that the other readings aren't important, but they play a particular role in our communal life historically. Tim?
I mean, we have multiple people every year coming into the church. And so I think we're minimalizing or narrowing scripture readings every year just to the year A. I think I would love to see them expand the readings, not just keep it to year A. What we try to do is we have the people at different masses, but all they hear is year A readings every year.
I'll only tell you that, when I was a young priest, this is a confession, I rewrote the scrutinies to go with cycles B and C when we were in those years. And I would never do that today. I've been converted really to see those A readings and the wisdom of focusing on those. Yes, it does narrow our scriptural selection in some way. Maybe there's an invitation there for the church to think about how to expand the whole lectionary so that we do hear those readings on some other occasions. I don't have a solution to that. But personally, I'm now convinced that those readings are important enough that we should do them. All right, thank you all. This has been fun. Enjoy the rest of the time. Thanks for coming.